Hello. In this lecture, I would like to demonstrate the process of creating a new Android application. This is going to include previous things that we learned in other lectures, such as creating a new project and also running a project in the emulator. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on Android Studio and bring it up. You're going to notice when I bring up Android Studio that it's going to show the previous project that we were editing. In this case, my test project. I want to actually demonstrate the whole process of creating the application. So I'm going to go ahead and close this application by going to File, Close Project. You're going to see it has my test project listed up here because it was a previous project loaded. But I want to start a new Android Studio project. We've learned all about this in the past, so this is going to go pretty quickly. I'm going to name this project Hello World. This is a typical name for a project when you create a new project for the first time. The package name is going to stay the same. We don't need any C++ support. I'm going to keep it in the default location of my user directory. I'm going to hit Next. I'm going to take Android Suggestion API level 15 because I want this app to run on as many devices as possible. It's going to be a phone and tablet app. I'm not going to use any other modules. I'm going to hit Next. I'm going to go ahead and select an empty activity using the templates here. Nothing on the screen. Hit Next again. I'm going to keep these as default as well. I'm only going to have one screen in this simple application. It's going to be called Main Activity. I am going to generate an XML layout file. This is going to contain my graphical components. I'm going to name that layout file activity_main. I'm going to make sure the project is backward compatible. So I'm going to go ahead and finish. It's going to generate this project just like it did in my test project. You're going to see the source code right here. And essentially, when you create an Android app, this is the first thing you're going to do. You're going to need to create a new project every time you create a new Android app. Once you create your project, you're then going to need to edit any source code. Maybe you want to add a new user interface. You want to interact with that user interface. But typically, the process is editing that source code. You then want to compile that source code. And you then want to run the source code that was compiled on the emulator or hardware device. Typically the emulator because it's faster and easier to use. And that's the process that you're going to follow every time you create a new Android application. Creating a project, editing the source code, compiling that project, and then running that project. So that's what I want to demonstrate now. I created my project. I'm all good there. I want to make this project a little bit more interesting. Right now it's showing up with an empty screen or maybe a default hello world. So I'm going to edit the source code. Some of the concepts I'm going to discuss here you may not fully understand, but that's okay because we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail. What you'll notice in this Java source file here is it's a main activity class. It only has 2 real lines of code. You'll see this onCreate method. This onCreate method is pretty important. It's the method that gets called when you run the application. It's similar to the main method in Java. On lines 10, we're just using a superclass to call an onCreate method. In line 11, we're actually loading the XML file that contains our graphical components by calling setContentView. The way that Android applications are designed are the graphical user interface is written using a graphical editor and then saved in an XML file. And there are many advantages to this, and we're going to talk about this in more detail as well. But the main advantage of this is you're separating the user interface from the Java source code, which basically interacts with that interface. The XML is creating the interface. The Java source code is interacting with it. It's logic to react to the interface. So right now in line 11, and because of this, I should say, because of this separation, it's a lot easier to maintain your code. If all of your source code was written in Java to create the user interface, first of all, there'd be a lot of source code. Second of all, whenever you made modifications to the user interface, you'd have to make modifications to your Java source code. In the method of just having the XML file contain the graphical user interface, if you ever want to swap out a graphical user interface, all you have to do is change line 11 to load a new XML file. It's pretty simple. So you can find this actual layout file under the res folder. If you go to the res folder and you go to layout, you're going to see activitymain.xml. Again, I want to make this application interesting, so I'm just going to modify this. When you're bringing up an XML file that contains a graphical interface in Android Studio, you're going to see the graphical editor on the right side, and then you're going to see the XML content as well. You can also see the design view if you switch back and forth between text and design, which is a little bit better. Now again, I'm not demonstrating how to create a graphical user interface in this lecture. I'm just demonstrating how to create an app. And to make it interesting, I'm just going to modify the text that shows on the screen. So I'm just going to say something like hello Jason. I'm hard coding it. I'm not using any resources. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And this is just going to demonstrate some modification of code. I'm going to go ahead and close this and go back to my Java editor. Once you're done editing your source code, the next step is to compile and run it. And what you're going to be noticing as you're creating more and more code, this is the process you're going to constantly follow. Editing source code, compiling, running. Or when you have errors, editing source code, compiling, finding an error, fixing that error, recompiling, and then once you're successful, you run on your emulator. So I made a change to the source code, so now I have to recompile. The way that you compile code in compilation, the process of compilation is you're taking the compiler essentially is going to check your code to see if there are any errors, any syntax errors. And if there are syntax errors, you'll have to go and fix them. But the compiler does not check logic errors. Logic errors are errors in the intent of your program, the functionality of your program. The compiler is only going to check whether or not you have syntax problems. And so you can compile your code by going up to the build option on the menu bar and saying make project. You see other options here to make your module app. We only have one module in this application. So by making the project or making the module app, it's the same thing. If you had multiple modules in here, if you're writing an app for Android Wear or Android Auto, you could build each separate module. And if you wanted to build all the modules, you say make project. The other important thing in the build menu is building an APK. An APK is the executable of Android. This is what you need when you want to upload your application to the Google Play Store. You need to build an app, an APK. And then you also need to generate a signed APK. But we'll talk about that more in the future. For this lecture, we just want to say make project. When we click make project, it's going to try to compile your source code. And it's important to understand what's happening in the compilation process to see if you have any errors. So you'll want to monitor the compilation process. So you'll want to bring up a certain window. The way that you can see the output of the compilation is you can go to Tools, you can go to View. You could say Tool Windows, and you could say Gradle Console. Remember that Gradle is your build system. It does a lot more than just compile. It brings in all dependencies and everything else. But to see the result of your compilation, the output, you want to go to the Gradle console. This is going to show you the output. Right now it's saying the build is successful. If you had any errors in your source code, it would say it wasn't successful. So for demonstration purposes, let's just add some errors. I'm just going to add some source code. I'm going to go ahead and save it, hit Control S. And now I'm going to go back and compile. So I'm going to go build, make project. You're now going to see the output. First of all, it brings up two windows. You can probably change that in the project settings. It's going to bring up this messages window, and it's going to say there's an error. I like looking at the console because it usually gives me more detail. So I'm going to go to the console, the Gradle console, and I'm going to see what my error is. It's saying that essentially you always want to look at the first error before you fix anything. The first error is the most important one because if the other errors may be a result of the first, so always try to fix that first error. It's saying that your expected site content view is an error. It doesn't understand that there's an error on the previous line because there's no semicolon. So you could actually select this link. It will tell you the error is on line 12, but really the error is on line 13 because I have a statement that doesn't make sense. So I'm going to delete it just to get it to compile. I'm going to resave it, compile it, and this time it will be successful. Once I have a successful compilation, I then want to load it on the emulator and run it. So now I have a successful compilation. I'm going to go to run, and I'm going to run my app. This is going to bring up a window that shows me all of my configurations for my emulator. I only have one. If you had a device connected to your computer, you could test it on the device. But as I mentioned in previous lectures, a lot of advantages to run it on the emulator. I'm going to select my one emulator that's running Android O, and I'm going to say OK. It's going to start the emulator, and it's going to load my application on the emulator so that I can verify that it's correct. So here's the Android emulator. It's starting up. It's going to load my application, and I should see my text as modified with Hello Jason in the center, and I do. Typically, when you run the emulator, you're going to have a lot more interesting application. You're going to have buttons. You're going to have all sorts of different graphical components. What you're going to want to test in the emulator is clicking those buttons and making sure screens show up as they should, making sure that all your logic is correct. Now, this is a simple application with just text showing in the middle of the screen. Not much going on here. So our first app is running correctly, and it's doing what we want it to do. Now, just for demonstration purposes and to give you a little bit more of knowledge, I want to just tell you something that you can do, but that you probably shouldn't. On line 11, I mentioned that we're loading the XML, which contains our graphical components, by doing this set content view. You don't have to do that. Now, as I said earlier, it's a very good thing to do, and you will want to do this when writing all your applications because it separates the user interface from the Java source code. But you still could write all of your graphical user interface code in your Java source file. So if I comment out this set content view, I just want to show you how you can create graphical components in your Java source code. So you can actually create a layout, and you can create the text view using the source code. So luckily, I actually have that already written. It is a few more lines of code, and I don't want to take up the time in the lecture to manually type out those lines. So let me bring that up and show you. So it's not too many lines of code. It's about 5 or 6 lines. This code is actually going to, like I said, create the layout and then also create a text view, which is showing text on the screen, and then it's going to actually set that text. So in lines 12, we're creating a layout. 14 to 16, we're creating a text view, which contains some text, and then we're adding the text to a view. Line 20, we're actually adding that whole layout to our application. Again, you don't need to know this right now. This is essentially what the XML code is doing, except it's not doing it in Java code. It's doing it in XML by using the graphical editor. So again, as always, when we add and edit source code, we want to save it, and we want to go to the build, and we want to build it. I'm going to say make project. You're going to notice I have some errors here. It doesn't know these classes, these relative layout classes, because I didn't add import statements. So I need to add the relevant import statements if I'm using certain Java class files, specifically Android widgets. I'm going to add the 2 imports that we need to compile successfully, which is the text view class and the relative layout class. I'm going to save it again. I'm going to go back and I'm going to build. I'm going to say make project. You're going to see that I still have another error. rstring.welcome, it doesn't understand what that resource is. If I double click that, it's going to take me to the line. This is a resource. I don't have a resource for this. We'll talk about resources in a lot more detail. I'm going to just hard code this to what I want it to show on the screen. I need to include it in double quotes, so I'm just going to say something like hello Jason. I'm going to save it, recompile it. This time, 3rd time's a charm. Hopefully it will work. It does compile successfully. So now I can actually run this code on an emulator. I'm going to go to run, say run app. The emulator is already running, so it's just going to actually start it up. And it did actually rebuild as well. This time when I run the application, you'll notice that the text is not in the center of the screen. It's actually coming up in the left-hand corner. That's because I didn't add any Java code to center it. And this is one of the advantages of the XML and the GUI editor, is this can all be done for you a lot easier than writing manually writing code. So this is just, again, a demonstration of how you can write actual Java code to create your components. You're not going to want to do this. I want to emphasize that. We're going to create all of our graphical user interfaces in our XML using the graphical editor. And again, there are advantages to this. It separates the code. It makes the code easier to maintain. But under the hood, what's happening is you're utilizing these Android source code, Android widgets, and so forth to create it. So this is the process of creating a new application. We go through this whole workflow of creating a new project, editing source code, compiling. If we have any compile errors, we fix them, then we recompile, and then we run that code. And the process that you're going to want to follow in addition to this is whenever you edit your source code, you want to edit small chunks of code and then test it. So you're going in this constant process of editing small chunks, testing, editing, testing. And the reason for editing only a small amount of code and then testing it is it's much easier to find and fix your errors. If you're editing or adding 50 or 100 new lines of code and then compiling it and testing it, it's going to be a lot harder to fix those errors because now you have to deal with 100 lines of code. If you work in a way where you only edit or add a small amount of code and then constantly test it, it's going to be easier to debug. So we wrote our first app, big step. What I would like you to do outside of this lecture is to do what I just did. Compile your code, run it, change it a little bit, and go through this process. It's going to help familiarize you with this process of creating and compiling and running. And you're also going to get familiar with the IDE and everything else. So please write your first app, your first Hello World app, get it working on the emulator, and it's going to be very rewarding. So good luck and very exciting. We're going to talk in more detail about some of the concepts we talked about in this lecture as far as resources. But this is a good start. Thanks.